press the button if I'm you. I was working out earlier on this week, and I knew that that Lina had taken the risk of inviting me to introduce myself. I introduced her.
Thank you.
But it's almost 25 years since I last gave a lecture in Broadley. I'm not really threatening you with another one, but it is that long ago, because I didn't often work in this particular building, and I'm very conscious that it is a much more particular building now than it was 25 years ago. So I'm also conscious that I don't want to assume a lecturing posture. In fact, as I recently had serious surgery to my abdomen, I don't think I could adopt a lecturing posture very easily. My posture is more a cross between Harry Worth and possibly Charlie Drake. But genuinely, I am absolutely delighted to have the opportunity in public of extolling the virtues of my wife. I don't often get that chance. And I've known Lina, one form or another, for over 20 years, and I admire her hugely, more than anyone else. I have witnessed her development and growth in all sorts of ways. Academic, educational, self-awareness, confidence. I could go on. And this lecture she's going to give is, I would never use the word culmination, because that suggests she's reached her peak. And one of the things Lina never does is reach her peak, because she finds others to climb or create. But this is certainly the culmination of a huge amount of effort on her part. This is, in a sense, her coming out. Now, if I'd said that 80 years ago, that would involve sort of balls and banquets and being introduced to the monarch. Now, coming out is a much more significant thing that people do. It's not a sign of wealthy families and privilege. It's a sign of commitment and courage and real bravery sometimes to face personal demons or tragedies. And Lina's had a lot of those to face. And her lecture today is going to be a real combination of putting together historical context, cultural context. It's cutting a slice through the tragic history of India at a particular time, relating it to her family, and finally presenting herself and where she's got to through all the effort she's made in the last many years. So I'm always hesitant to use the word pride. If I say I'm proud of someone, I feel like I'm claiming something that's not mine to claim. So I tend to use the word admire, which is where I started. So with a huge amount of admiration, I'd like to introduce you to Lina Mookerjee.
Right, I'm going to start. So, good evening, everyone. Good evening. Can you see me?
Yes. Just about.
Thank you. Thank you. More importantly, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. I don't take senses for granted, as you can see, as a carer and wife to Richard, who's both deaf and blind. It's really important that you can hear this story today in whatever way you can, and for it to be a whole body experience, not simply narrative. That's the aim very much of my presentation today, or this evening, should I say.
Good evening, everyone, and I welcome you to this first Praxis lecture here at my alma mater of Nottingham Trent University. It was 30 years ago last month that I started my first degree as a somewhat naive 18-year-old electrical engineering undergrad here in this very building, Newton Building, at what was then Trent Polytechnic. Never did I think I would be standing on this side of the lecture theatre and still be in Nottingham 30 years later. Tonight is about raising awareness of the impact of consequences that come from ill thought through decisions and actions, more precisely political ones, and the learning that can be gained. I invite you on a journey to explore how a major world-changing event affected those who had no power to influence the decision forced upon them, and how they dealt with this. I stand here in front of you as a witness to this impact, and to give voice to those who suffered and continue to, in a silence powered by trauma, shame, and pain. 70 years ago, the world map would change forever. It was in August 1947 that India finally gained her independence after 500 years of domination, first under the Mughal Empire, followed by the British Empire. For the last 70 years, little has been understood in the West about the psychosocial impact of this tragedy. For those affected by shock, fear, ill health and trauma effect, their focus centered on survival, and their principal way of coping was to forget the horror of their experience. The consequences of such a coping strategy inevitably leads to multiple complications further down the line. The purpose of this lecture is to raise awareness about the hidden cost of this suffering that affected so many and the learning to be gained. So in this lecture we will explore 1. The context of India's partition, 2. The human impact and cost, when I introduce the term partition trauma, and where I will invite you to explore a direct experience of partition trauma through my father's story, and an indirect experience of partition trauma through my own. 3. Making sense of the resulting chaos. 4. Healing from partition trauma, finding inner peace and moving forwards. 1. Context of India's partition and independence. Britain's once mighty empire, then beleaguered and exhausted by the suffering and fallout from World War II, was facing its greatest colonial and political crisis. Regarded as the most prized jewel in Queen Victoria's crown, India had been actively campaigning to end 250 years of imperial domination. The key political players were Jawaharlal Nehru, Mahatma Gandhi, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and Lord Louis Mountbatten, who was the monarch's representative, the monarch at the time being King George VI. Knowing that independence was inevitable and to reduce mounting violence and chaos, in June 1947 Home Rule was finally granted by Labour Prime Minister Clement Attlee. But there was one momentous condition. India would become partitioned according to religious population majorities. This was a new bargaining factor at the negotiating table. And it has only recently come to light that negotiations for a Muslim state had secretly taken place in 1943 between Churchill and Jinnah in London, where plans were drawn up that demarcated land and boundaries for Muslims, as well as allowing access for the British to enter the Middle East for oil. Eventually in 1947 these plans were used by Cyril Ratcliffe, who was officially tasked to create a new country with boundaries that would demarcate India and Pakistan, and these would be known as the Ratcliffe Lines. And at this stage I want to raise a very important point. There was no exit strategy in place. No thought was given at all to the consequences that partition would have on the Indian people, their communities, their homes, and their lives. Partition was a rationally made decision based on political necessity to be simply carried out. Establishing new national boundaries created new dominions. East and West Pakistan for Muslims, and the remainder of India would be home to Hindus and Sikhs. The partition also involved the division of two provinces, Bengal and the Punjab, based on Hindu or Muslim majorities. It also involved the division of the British Indian Army, the Royal Indian Navy, the Indian Civil Service, the railways, and the Central Treasury between the two new dominions. The partition was set forth in the Indian Independence Act of 1947 and resulted in the dissolution of the British Raj, i.e. the British government in India. It also ended the unofficial state of apartheid that had existed within India under British rule. There was an area in the southern part of Calcutta, which was once the imperial capital, called White Town, where the British lived and worked, and no coloured Indian was allowed near these salubrious suburbs except in roles as servants. My father would recall as how a boy he was not allowed to go near the extravagant shopping area called Newmarket on the famous Chaurungi Road in central Calcutta. These were built for the rich and powerful British Memsahibs to do their shopping for exotic textiles, jewellery, perfumes, clothing, spices, food, and of course tea. And these were all in plentiful amounts. In later life, Dad would feel immense pride when he and Mum were finally able to buy their flat in Lake Gardens in South Calcutta, a suburb that would only have once been occupied by the British elite. The execution of partition involved huge bloodshed and violence. There was no planned British exit strategy, and implementation of this long-disputed political solution came at a huge cost in human lives. Communities of mixed religions that had once coexisted together, often for centuries, were now divided by suspicion and considered each other as enemies. Through powerful propaganda and the British Raj, who encouraged these divisions by abstaining from taking action when public fighting broke out, communities now were prepared to fight and kill in the name of religion and territory. This was a horrifying and terrifying state of affairs for the millions who were now facing great uncertainty and danger. Regarded as the greatest mass migration of people in the world had known, over 15 million people became displaced as refugees in their own former country, and over 1 million were killed. Those who became refugees were faced with some very difficult situations and choices to be made. India was no longer the place they had known as home, no longer a safe place to live and work. The social rules and bureaucratic organisation endorsed by the British Empire that had been respected and followed so meticulously for so long were now in chaos. 2. The human impact. Personal experience. So what exactly was the human cost of India's partition? As you will find out, the human impact of partition is very complex. As an engineer, I was trained to value systems and the efficiency of their operation through good regulation and maintenance. All my life, my own system, my body, my mind and my spirit has suffered from angst, self-doubt and shame, which undermined my ability to feel psychologically safe, to feel able and confident to flourish and experience my potential. I have actively spent the last 20 years trying to make sense of the dysfunctionality that I observed and experienced as a child, witnessing the pain my parents went through and how we would all suffer in our own ways. From being a very small child, I always knew our lives were worth more than just struggle, expecting to go through the motions of reduced societal expectations, having to feel grateful for our lot that came at a huge price on all levels. Instead, I always sensed that there was a chance to grow into what was possible in the face of our adversity, but the effort needed to do this was huge. I needed to find the crucial people to help me know that this was possible. Along with the many teachers, therapists, and mentors I have worked with, the following are the people and their theories that have helped me to make sense of the chaotic miasma arising from the fallout of my family's partition trauma experience. Let me introduce you to them. Donald Winnicott and his true self, false self theory. John Bowlby's theory of attachment, where he said that when we have access to a secure base, we develop the ability to form trust and healthy relationships. Carl Rogers' concept of a fully functioning person, and how the environment we were raised in so affects our ability to exist, to function, and flourish. Melanie Klein's work on child development and how infant emotions are processed, and the struggles that form when the mother or caregiver is unreceptive or simply unable to. Carl Jung and the acknowledgement of the individuation process, making the unconscious conscious to allow for healing to happen and ultimately to form an integrated self. Eric Berne and his transactional analysis theory, offering the model of ego states and how humans exist as parent, adult and child. Also his concept of how strokes, i.e. moments of social interaction, are key to affirming our existence. Stephen Cartman's drama triangle that helps make sense of destructive interactions that can occur between people in conflict, resulting in positions of rescuer, persecutor and victim, with the aim of developing an adult position that is thinker, who has access to resources for change and is no longer trapped by the damage-causing dramas. And finally, Drs. Daniel Siegel, Candace Pert and Deepak Chopra, and looking at the principles of neuroscience through the mind-body paradigm. Trauma, as we know, creates unstable emotional states of vacillating between rigidity and chaos. Healing from trauma is to find the window of harmony through the process of integrating fragmented parts of self by developing a key part of the brain. How you think affects how you experience the world, from within and without, and this is the key to freedom. My father's story, a direct experience of partition trauma. I invite you now to close your eyes. Connect with your house, your family, friends, locality, shops, land, workplace, conversations, and even your school. Connect with your ancestors and all of those who came before you, all that you've known as your home territory in your life history. Imagine waking up to hear the news that your country is changing. The place you live in is no longer in the country you knew, and you have to move, or else your life is uncertain and possibly in danger. All that you've known is changing, assuming for the worse, because literally you don't know what the future holds. To stay means you will have to take on an inferior status, and your language is no longer officially recognized. To survive requires you to move to territory where your faith and language are officially recognized as the majority, and you might have better rights. But choosing to leave means you have to give up your home, your land, work, access to education, friendships, communities and more. All that you have known as your home territory and what John Bowlby would call the secure base. This was the road to nowhere for many who woke up on the morning of the 16th of August 1947. when the new demarcated boundaries of India and Pakistan were officially announced to the world on national and international radio and would take immediate effect. This was the reality that my father and his family faced. At 16 years old, his world changed forever. Known as East Bengalis, his long ancestry Hindu family lived in a place called Jessore, 130 kilometres from Calcutta. The problem was that his home was now on the wrong side of the border in what was now the Muslim majority country of East Pakistan and would eventually become Bangladesh in 1971. Being landowners, all their income came from land produce, most notably rice, as well as rent from tenant farmers. Being Brahmin, the priestly class, they had status and respect within the well-established and close-knit community whereby Hindus, Muslims, Christians and Jews coexisted. Once partition hit, Dad's family faced two choices: to stay or go. As governance was now changing under the influence of Islamic ideals, to stay living as a Hindu minority meant they would have reduced rights and access to resources. They would also have to change their language from Bengali to Urdu. This was a no-no for the staunch Hindu Bengalis who prided themselves on their language, politics, intellectual debate, faith and religious tolerance. Moving to Calcutta was their only option for survival. To do so meant they had to give up everything, including their known family and social infrastructure, to become refugees in their new independent country of India. And this is what they chose to do. Sadly, instead of being met with benevolence from the now powerful and controlling West Bengalis, they faced ridicule, rejection, prejudice and discrimination by the authorities and communities. The East Bengalis were regarded as country folk, simple people who lived a way of life that hadn't changed in centuries. As refugees, they were considered as country bumpkins, almost takers and drainers with nothing to contribute. With no welfare state, they were allocated the worst land to live on, which was situated the farthest away from accessible, reliable and decent paid work. Schooling was disrupted as a result of partition, and for years there was no clear education system set up. Social mobility was definitely not on the agenda. For Dad, as the eldest of 6 children, and now 2 shell-shocked parents, his profound sense of duty emerged, and would continue until he died. He knew he had to act, to earn enough money to help support his family and to help them build a home. Without telling his parents, in 1948 and at 17 years old, he joined the Merchant Navy as a trainee seaman, electrician, on board a Scottish-owned cargo vessel. Life at sea literally became his access to the world as he witnessed old empires collapsing and a rebirth happening. In the 5 years he spent at sea, he visited every major port in the world, from Sydney to Hong Kong, Cape Town to New York, and San Francisco to Vietnam, all through the Middle East and of course England, his first UK port being Tilbury in 1950. He sailed through both the Suez and Panama canals and was so proud of having sailed across both tropics of Cancer and Capricorn and the international date line, but regretted he never got to Russia nor South America. He recalled how in 1951 he arrived in the city he loved, New York, and would get to visit 3 times. He shared how he walked through Central Park and visiting the Bronx, drinking coffee with Black Americans, and bearing in mind he had never ever seen an African American before. And this triggered his love for the Rat Pack, Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr., but not Sinatra, as he thought he was too big-headed and couldn't sing. He even managed to visit a famous Hindu temple. This was my dad meeting his adventurous spirit. All his meagre wages were sent home, and he was never able to buy a camera, but those graphical memories were well installed within him, as I would find out. His ability and willingness to watch, witness, and be interested in world events was amazing for someone suffering traumatic fallout. He wanted to know what was going on, and knowing how crucial language was, he was desperate to perfect his English. And he did so by listening to the BBC via the ship's shortwave radio and reading the entire range of Penguin classics that were available in the ship's library. Eventually, in 1955, he arrived in England having jumped ship, a survival-based decision that remained a source of and target of guilt and shame for the rest of his life. For the next 5 years, while safely based in Birmingham, Dad worked for various engineering companies, splitting between working 6.5 days a week and night school for 3 nights a week at Aston Tech, which is now Aston University, studying for his OND in electrical engineering. Sadly, with only a year left to qualify, he never got to complete it as he didn't have enough available money to pay for his studies. In 1961, after successfully earning his right to stay and receiving his prized blue British passport, Dad went back to Calcutta to finally see his family and married Mum through an arranged marriage fixed within 7 days. She was an 18-year-old girl who was extremely clever, who loved learning and being at school, having only formally started her education at 12 because of partition. Yet, within 6 months, and married to a man she'd hardly had time to know, she was pregnant and boarding a plane to England, to no home of their own, and Dad had no job. The Bengali Raj, emergence of a new social strata. During the 1950s and 60s, Britain's National Health Service was growing. In order to fill their need for medical doctors and consultants, the NHS reached out to India. The irony was that it was Wolverhampton MP Enoch Powell, famous for his rivers of blood speech and then health minister, who appealed for help to staff his massively expanding health service. More than 18,000 doctors from the Indian subcontinent answered his call. Many of the doctors came from Calcutta, where medical training was the most highly respected, and so a new social strata began to develop within the UK's growing Bengali community, a new middle class that I coin the Bengali Raj. As the Bengali community grew, so did meeting of caste and class, most notably through an unspoken evaluating framework of how new members would be judged and ranked in terms of their acceptability. I use airport customs terminology of green channel and red channel to describe the social evaluation system used by immigrant Bengalis and what would contribute to a growing class difference. Those who were welcome professionals entered via the green channel, and those like my father definitely walked the lower grade red channel. Put bluntly, if you were a West Bengali doctor or engineer, you and your family were regarded as God. If you were working class, particularly in East Bengal affected by partition, which we were, this reduced your ranking. You knew your place and became a target of potential rejection, teasing, humiliation, and shame. Competitive jostling began between all families as the signature of success was to become middle class and accepted as part of the Bengali Raj inner circle. So what were the measures? Simple. Material success, children's attractiveness, cleverness and educational achievements, private education, one's profession, earning power, car, house, location, quality of saris worn at events, how children were dressed, passing the 11 plus, getting into grammar school. The list went on and on and on, and so did the pressure to conform. A new external locus of acceptability was forming. Yet there was an anomaly in our case. We were Brahmin, the highest ranking priests of the Aryan-influenced Hindu caste system, which gave us kudos and respect and raised our status level. For the next 20 years, Dad would become a highly respected and popular priest, administering all the festivals, births, deaths and marriages in the community, just as his forefathers would have done. People literally would travel from all parts of the country to watch him in action during the famous Durga Pujas and Diwali celebrations. As a family, it filled us with pride to be part of the action and being on stage. But the stigma from partition shame and the subsequent working class position in both societies remained ripe for both of my parents, and we would inherit this as a kind of learned helplessness. We were all living within this unspoken complex set of social dynamics. The effects of partition for my father. 1. Sense of belonging. Looking at Bowlby's theory of attachment, experiencing a secure base is key to healthy functioning and relating in life. If we feel safe, we can take risks. Dad was a well-loved and wanted child and had a good sense of home base within his extended family, and was proud to be Bengali. The trauma of partition created a dreadful emotional rupturing experience in his life, from which he never fully recovered. To lose all that had defined his sense of belonging, his home, family house, being part of his family and the community he had always known, was simply too much. He learned to cope by doing rather than ever reflecting on the pain of his loss. Although he could tell us the stories, he actively avoided sharing his feelings, and I learned very early on that it was a no-go area to ask. Dad was never emotionally nor physically able to return to Jesso. It was simply far too painful for him. Yet, with his experience of a secure base, his capacity to adapt and belong went with him. He was highly sociable, charismatic and well loved by so many, including the English communities that he became part of, and taking the anglicised name of George. Learning to live within a Western community with very different ideals, social norms, culture and even food and drinking alcohol was both a challenge and enjoyment for Dad. He'd recall his affection for the many white bosses who took him under their wing, including being invited to Saturday night theatre shows and dances, and how he'd always be invited on Christmas Day for lunch, so he'd never be on his own. He would also recall his disaster with drinking port for the first time, half a bottle on an empty stomach, not wise for a young Indian man's system who wasn't used to alcohol. He also loved to tell the story about Mrs. Hall, his landlady, and how one day she expressed with great excitement that she'd made him curry for dinner. We are talking 1955 here, and Dad was bemused at the prospect. Out she brought a plate of cold turmeric-coloured rice pudding. Yes, she had stirred in curry powder, and was so proud to try and make my dad feel at home. But Dad, being Dad, ate it with appreciation, told her not to work so hard, and encouraged her to keep up with her speciality of steamed pudding and custard, one of his favourites. Yet he increasingly struggled to feel accepted within the arrogance of the unforgiving Bengali community. Trying to keep up with these growing societal expectations to give his family a sense of dignity, he got into mounting debt which he kept secret from us. His sense of safe belonging in the UK was threatened in the 1970s and 80s, with increasing hostility due to the threatening rise of the National Front and Thatcher's entry onto the scene. We regularly had bricks thrown at our windows, anonymous offensive letters pushed through our front door, receiving disturbing phone calls, being followed and called horrendous names, and even waking up one morning to find our car was turned upside down in the middle of our main road. The police did nothing. It was a very frightening time, and along with sudden redundancy in 1981 after 20 years as a maintenance electrician at his beloved IMI, the risk of losing the family home again and humiliating rejection by the Bengali community Dad's buried trauma symptoms emerged through increased drinking, depression, and physical illness. When I was 12, I lost my dad for almost a decade. His shell shock had finally caught up, and he was locked away in an emotional prison of silent suffering, pain, and regret that no one could access to help set him free. Mental illness is a great stigma in Indian society and will often be repressed, denied, ignored, or displaced as physical illness instead of being acknowledged. Heart disease and diabetes became the norm. To watch my father in this highly vulnerable and powerless state, meeting his dark night of the soul, was terrifying for me. Both of my sisters had left home to pursue their degrees, and I was alone with my mother, who was by now fueled by her own justified anger and rage, driven by her own terror of life falling apart. Yet she took control by becoming the family's breadwinner, as she went to work and kept our family going, for which I will always be grateful. I was now living in a highly volatile home, with nowhere to go, and I had to find my own survival. To bring my dad back became my aim, and I was determined not to let him go under. 2. A sense of identity. Dad was amazing in his ability to be both Bengali and British, and adapt to living in two cultures, especially at the time of Britain's 1960s cultural revolution. With the scale of loss that came from partition, the drastic effects of rupture from all that was known, and having to learn how to adapt to a new country and its culture, Dad's sense of identity became even more important. As a staunchly proud Bengali, there were 4 things that defined him, and he was proud of: language, his Brahmin status, his socialist politics, values and principles, and finally his spiritual faith, in terms of yoga consciousness and more. He drew strength from all, especially at times when his confidence and position were threatened, and of course when he wanted a good debate. That's what Bengalis are famous for. And it's no coincidence that 6 out of India's 10 Nobel Prize winners came from Calcutta. As British, it was gaining his blue passport that was so affirming of his now acceptable British identity, that he held with such pride and gratitude. He knew from the outset that integrating as part of British society was essential for him and a future family, and that's what he did. He loved cars, driving, food and music. Dean Martin, Nat King Cole and Matt Monro became his idols, including dressing like them. As he taught us, when in Rome, act like a Roman. Mum and Dad were very conscious of the names they chose for their daughters, all European, to enable them to be accepted in Western society and avoid being teased. Yet Mum and Dad faced great racial prejudice within the white community in which they chose to live and bring up their children. As well as facing cruel name-calling and teasing from ignorant members of the public, the process of buying their first house in 1965 was a profound example of prejudice. It was required for Dad's work manager to send an official reference proving Dad's worthiness to have a mortgage and to countersign the mortgage application paperwork. How did this feel when this didn't apply to his white colleagues? Dad would just reply, "That's what we had to do." But also Mum was never invited into our neighbours' houses. She was proud to wear her sari that demonstrated her Bengali identity, and she looked beautiful. Also an excellent cook, she learned how to be Mum through the weekly mentoring and guidance letters sent by airmail by her guilt-ridden mother, and she kept every one of them. But her outward difference and the gorgeous Indian cooking smells that would emerge from our home were deemed too foreign and therefore to be avoided by our white neighbours. Instead, the back garden fence became their social meeting point for conversing and sharing parenting experiences. It's amazing how tastes and attitudes have changed in recent years, where curries are now favoured and there is acceptance of India's exotic riches. Also, the now blooming Western yoga consciousness making big money for so many supposed Western gurus and shallow self-authenticating yoga authorities, insensitively taking from the very sacred Indian wisdom that was once scorned and ridiculed by the British Empire. Just like how colonies were there to be used and abused by empires to profit from. This cultural misappropriation would confuse and deeply hurt my parents and infuriate me. The very qualities that defined their identity was not only scorned and rejected, but was now being used as tokens of worth. What hypocrisy. 3. A sense of self. Dad was first and foremost someone whose sense of duty came above all else. As the eldest child, he saw his role as provider and to serve the needs of the larger group and collective. This is the basis of Indian consciousness, where the collective's needs are above those of the individual, and he acted this out in technicolor. The experience of partition fueled this necessity even more, as he spent his whole life trying to make things better for others at the expense of his own needs. With working all hours, Dad did build his family a respectable home and paid for countless relatives to be educated, married, for hospital treatment and more, as well as helping many people here in the UK. It's what Cartman calls the rescuer position, as he tried to save the many people he encountered in victim positions, and yet never took account of his own worth or able to give himself credit. Using Rogers's concept of the external locus, with the Bengali Raj as the critical evaluator and English society as another, he felt he wasn't ever good enough and had failed to fulfill whatever he thought he should have in order to be regarded as acceptable as a good man, husband and father. That's what unprocessed shame and trauma does. My story. An indirect experience of partition trauma. My entry into the world. By 1968, Mum and Dad had been married for 7 years, and my sisters were now 5 and 6 years old. They were now in their own home, and Dad's job at IMI was permanent. They were finally building their sense of secure base, and ready to try again for a son. Within Indian culture, sons are the preferred gender, and girls are viewed disparagingly as burdens. So to have a son would be viewed as saviour, bringing hope and dignity to the family. A week before my birth, my parents both had the same dream on the same night that a special child was going to be born. They assumed they were going to be blessed with a son. My birth in May 1969 was met with great disappointment. Although I would be physically well cared for, emotionally I was rejected, abandoned, and punished for simply existing and for being the unwanted girl. I was constantly teased with the family story about being adopted and how the family's happiness was destroyed and I was to blame. It was a story that became my truth, as it was never disputed, and I believed them. It was a kind of bullying that happens in families where a child is often scapegoated to hold difficult projections, and it would have a profound adverse effect on my sense of self. As a toddler, I learned very early on that Mum was unwell, which she hid. She was eventually diagnosed with the then relatively unknown type 2 diabetes when I was only 5. 2 years prior to her eventual diagnosis, I had witnessed the many occasions that she had gone into diabetic hypos and blackouts, and I learned to work out what was needed to bring her back. I always secretly hoped that after every episode she would be different towards me, showing some affection for helping her, but it never happened. This was my training in hypervigilance to eventually become her secret, unofficial lookout and carer. My sense of self. My existence was never affirmed, and I learned it was simply too dangerous to be me. This started with my mum, who could never emotionally accept me and could never look at me. I became her source of shame and embarrassment. She would often secretly say to me how fat and ugly I was, and I believed her. Klein and Siegel talk about the importance of a mother looking at their baby, including mirroring and copying facial expressions, in order to relay to the baby that they exist. Also for bonding, to help regulate the baby's developing nervous system. Byrne, in his stroke theory, talks about the importance of touch and attention to confirm existence. But instead of expecting pleasant, life-affirming, warm, positive strokes, the thought of having no strokes was simply too awful for me. Why? Because it would perpetuate a dreadful deadness of my non-existence that I already was feeling. Any strokes were better than none, and so I learned to tolerate harshness, cruelty that was in jest, and the many cold silences by becoming an elected mute. My sense of belonging. Going back to Bowlby, I never experienced enough of a secure attachment with any member of my family. With very little access to build relationships with my extended family in India, whom we'd be able to visit once every 5 years, my closest attachment was with my dad. He was now working 12-hour shifts to earn extra money and possibly to avoid the growing conflict at home. I hardly saw him, and yet I learned to rely on the precious starvation rations of his affection. I experienced what was known as disorganized and insecure attachment. Sometimes I was included and wanted in the family, and yet at other times I was very obviously excluded, leaving me feeling highly vulnerable in my confusion. And this would go on to affect my ability to trust, to know my own judgment and be able to use it, and also to form friendships. I was terrified to be alone with my mum, as she was cold and punitive towards me. Any loving warmth towards me had become locked in a casket of stone that was now in her safe defence protection. I have no memories of being cuddled by her, nor sitting safely in her space or lap. It is when we were doing something that actually an energy was present, and I felt included. It was my first secondary school, a multicultural comprehensive that had recently changed from being grammar, that proved to be my salvation. For the next 5 years, it was my secure base of constant, reliable, and highly encouraging teachers who offered me windows to the world through learning. That for the first time I felt seen. They really saw me, my enthusiasm, and my potential, and boy did I love it. I became their prized pupil who relished their warm affection, knowledge, learnedness and attention. And this was definitely Rogers's theory of the importance of environment in action. Get it right and growth will flourish. And it did. So my secure base model was now developed, based on the reliable nature of study, learning, hard work, libraries and educational establishments, and also the role of rescuer stroke carer in the home. Yet this would become challenged once I left at 16 to join the sixth form at a grammar school in the constituency of Tory Minister Norman Fowler. It was here that I met the unfamiliar world of white middle-class privilege for the first time, and along with it came racial intolerance and discrimination. I was told that I had been given a place not simply based on my good O-level grades, but because they had to offer a certain number of places to girls from ethnic minority and disadvantaged backgrounds. Without knowing, I became labelled and unfairly prejudged before I'd been given a chance to express myself. I was now the country bumpkin, considered as a taker. I was denied crucial access to support when I needed it. I was also actively blocked from applying for training courses in engineering that were on offer for women in the early 80s. As money was so tight at home, I went to work to be able to pay for my own extra home tuition, and I did from all my Saturday job earnings. only to find out that these privileged girls were secretly offered extra classes at school to help them improve their chances of getting into Oxbridge. It was years later that I found out that many of them never finished their first year at uni. Apparently, they couldn't hack it. Sense of identity. Looking back, my sense of identity was based on survival, reacting to satisfy a multitude of external evaluating sources from both home and outside worlds that often conflicted with each other. I learned to defend myself by suppressing any engagement with my emotions, and instead redirected attention towards developing my left brain, sensible rationality of intellect through study, particularly the sciences. I learned it was too dangerous to connect with anything considered irrational, and that dreadful term touchy-feely, and this would come at a cost in later life, as my right brain would finally let me know. Alongside developing my survival strategy, the truth seeker in me began to silently witness my reality, and I began developing my own values and beliefs based on my ideals that I was now encountering, including reading the works of Lenin and Marx by the time I was 16, watching on TV the arrival of Gorbachev to the UK, and his famous meeting with Thatcher only enthralled me, and so would begin a lifelong interest in his career. His new consciousness of perestroika and glasnost gripped me as I wanted to find out a more fair way of living. These secret readings were never expressed and would remain hidden deep in my unconscious until I felt safe enough to express my own opinion. In 2011, I would eventually be in the presence of this hero, Mr. Gorbachev, as Richard and I went to his 80th birthday concert at the Royal Albert Hall. It was simply magic and a dream come true for me. Formation of my rescuer position. At 5, I finally found my existence affirmed by being a carer and rescuer to my mum's victim position as a diabetic, and at that point I came alive. I was now in touch with what Rogers calls conditions of worth, and it was to my mum that I sought my validation, and I got it as her helper. This developed further as my father became ill, and at 12 I became his rescuer and learned to walk the very slow path towards his recovery. I also wanted to protect his victim position from my mother's persecuting bullying, furious with his downfall, and her rage cut like a knife when you entered her space. It was very scary, and I learned it was safer to become invisible in order to avoid her wrath. Social mobility and rejection. So began the development of my self-concept as a rescuer that would give me reliable attention and affirmation. Coupled with a developing intellect and love of study, this would prove to be a very powerful and successful combination. The power of rescue would go on to inform so many decisions in my life, including my choice of first career as an electrical engineer. I wanted to make my parents proud, first by finishing off what Dad couldn't do, and then to get a job that would prove I was on the way to becoming successful and joining the ranks of the middle class. The more I studied and fulfilled this condition of worth, the further I moved away from my secure base of norms and relationships, including my parents' world, and a fading hope of their approval and love. As a consequence of all my efforts, I was now moving into the very social classes, the Bengali Raj, and predominantly white-collar work environments that were discriminating and rejecting of my parents. Now I was facing my own liminal space, a no man's land where I was discriminated and bullied at work, and moving further away from my parents' world. I felt I didn't belong anywhere. 3. Making sense of the chaos. In 1997, my life came to a head and I suffered a mental breakdown. Overwhelmed by an intense feeling of failure and shame at work as the unsuccessful engineer, I could take no more. I needed to get help. I was so fortunate to meet a very important person who literally saved my life. And so I could begin my process of recovery. A new life and self-concept emerged, but my buried, chaotic, unprocessed early life remained well out of my consciousness. In 2014, my life came to a head again. After facing a very turbulent and threatening year, as well as starting a doctorate, I finally met my rage and my fury. It was extremely scary because of its intensity and the potential to destroy everything that I had built. I was now becoming my mother. In the same year, I finally applied for my BACP accreditation as a psychotherapist, and it was this process that revealed the extent of my survival self as rescuer. I had reached the end of the road, and I finally stopped running to avoid my shadow drivers. The game was up. I had to make sense of the inner hell I was living in, or I was going to collapse once and for all. As a consequence, I realized I no longer wanted to live in this dumbed-down level of existence that was incapable of letting me be all of my potential. I was tired of living from my congruence of incongruence. So I chose to take responsibility and finally face myself. And so would begin 2 years of intense therapeutic processing. The schema complex. Through my journey of being born in the UK and holding both Bengali and British values, my life has been a very tenuous struggle of negotiating between this betwixt position. I was born into the pioneering phase of shared consciousness faced by first-generation children, struggling to find their place and navigate between these two worlds. The following are examples of statements offered to me during my life and would then create the unhealthy beliefs that I swallowed without awareness. So let me start with those from the Bengali community. You have a duty to serve the family, and the collective consciousness is more important than pursuing your own individual wants and desires. Remember, you've been much luckier than your cousins, so don't moan or be mean. Give your things away when they ask for them. Being focused on your own individual needs is selfish and not important. Be mindful of what people think. Don't step out of line and don't show us up. One marries for duty, not love. Remember, English marriages don't last. Ours do. Keep your head low and accept being grateful that England has given us a safe place to live, work and earn. You are only grown up once you have a child. I want you to be educated and to be able to stand on your own 2 feet and never to have to rely on a man. Remember, you're a Brahmin priest's daughter and you have to set an example to the community. We want you to be successful, but not too successful that you'll scare prospective suitors away from marriage. I don't know you anymore. You've become big, and I don't know your world of management. We're lowly people. Don't trust the world, only your family. Let me introduce you now to some of the interjects from the British community. You're an independent thinker who is clever and needs to use it. You're coloured and you expect me to write you a good reference for your university and polytechnic applications? Who do you think you are? And what do you expect? You are nothing. I would never even get an apprenticeship. You are a woman, and I don't know why we've accepted people like you on an engineering degree who would only go on to get married. What a waste. You're not my boss. Women are only fit to clean toilets, and I won't listen to you. We don't accept you in the yoga community. We do British yoga, and you do Indian yoga. You're nothing like us. We don't want you. You're okay. You're one of us, not like them packies. I may not see you, but you are a beautiful person whose inner flame is there. All these unprocessed experiences resulted in the chaotic confusion that I was living in and experiencing life through. Step by step in therapy, we worked together to unpick the confusing miasma of my inherited partition trauma's toxic fallout so I could process and make sense. I began to find out who I am as an individual. And by doing so, I could begin to gain some sense of personal power without guilt nor shame to build my ego strength, my own individual sense of self. And by doing so, I was now taking responsibility for my actions by developing the internal locus of evaluation, me making an evaluation of myself that would empower my decision capability and quality of life. No longer at the mercy of trying to satisfy all, I was enabled to trust my own body, my mind and my judgment. I was being enabled to operate my life now from what is known as the prefrontal cortex in the brain, what Siegel regards as the wisdom center of the self, and in Indian philosophy is the ajna point, the buddhi point. So in summary, the human cost of partition was great. Direct trauma created rupture of secure attachments and life as was known. No help and support for the exit strategy and no responsibility for policy. The mental anguish of post-traumatic stress disorder that was never recognized by the medical establishment and no empathy to help those affected. Discrimination faced by my own people and in the UK. A life driven by survival, a dysregulated nervous system that was prone to stress, disorders and chronic health conditions including heart disease and diabetes. Social isolation, alienation and lack of inclusion. And a sense of self contaminated by shame, betrayal and survivor guilt. For indirect trauma, this included the loss of a safe relationship with a well and good enough mother, the loss of a mother who saw me as an object and could never see me as her child, a separate person who simply wanted to be seen and loved by her, so we've missed out on having a chance to know each other, the loss of feeling loved and accepted for being who I am as an individual, an undeveloped and confused sense of self, a dysregulated nervous system and prone to stress and emotional disorders, as well as avoidance and loneliness. Living in a volatile household, goalposts changing all the time. Feeling confused with expectations, feeling guilty for having my own wants and desires, excitement and wellness, and all my faculties. Feeling angry and enraged without any resolution. Difficulty forming trust within myself and the relationships I form. Difficulty trusting my own judgment and feeling safe, not safe. Feeling wanted, unwanted. Feeling suspicious of the world. Healing from partition trauma. What are the lessons to be learned? Well, trauma is never forgotten. It simply gets packed away until its effects are felt when triggered by circumstances that create reminders of the original trauma-causing situation. If left unacknowledged and unprocessed, its effects become toxic and will leak out in all sorts of ways that go on to affect choices, behaviours, and ultimately a quality of life. The effects of shell shock reduce a sense of aliveness and vitality, such that choices become very limited as the focus is on survival and operating through a number of responses, including fight, manifesting as outbursts of anger, rage, grumbling unhappiness. That was my mum's way. Flight, manifesting as avoidance, depression, procrastination to suppress anything that creates a sense of aliveness. That was my dad. And then also the freeze response, feeling stuck, emotionally paralysed and unable to think through options and solutions. It was like revving in neutral and going nowhere. That was me. So I come to how meeting one's adversity can be a powerful catalyst for mobilising self-inquiry and ultimately change. From my experience, the lessons to be learned are as follows. Trauma often involves someone getting hurt and becoming a victim of the situation. But experiencing trauma does not mean it's a lifelong curse. As humans, we always have choice and therefore can take appropriate responsibility. And as humans, we have the capability of changing the way we live and regard life. Through the magic of awareness, we can begin to change the way we process life experience. And this is what we call neuroplasticity. And it all starts with awareness. By becoming aware, we can begin to see what's going on. And by acknowledging what's happening, we can begin to work out and accept the situation as is. By accepting the situation, we can release ourselves from the burden of wishing it was different and possibly to look at the possible options on offer. So what is the relevance of post-traumatic growth to partition trauma? Well, post-traumatic growth is all about reframing difficulties as challenges to better oneself and have a better quality of life. As I have shared, I have faced a lot of prejudice, exclusion and discrimination growing up in both communities as well as into my adult life. Deep down, I always knew my life could be so much bigger and better than the one I was presented. I was more than an unwanted child who could never get it right. I was more than the opportunity structures that I lived in, and much of my midlife rage was feeling the fallout of being denied so many opportunities because of my class, colour, gender, and the very fragmented sense of insecure self that I was carrying in secret within myself. And so began my journey for meaning through understanding, which brings me to the cathedral paradigm. Unbeknown to me at the time, it was the model that helped me to heal, that offered me a vision and hope for a better way of life. The cathedral paradigm was offered to me in 1994, when at 25 years old, I gained a significant promotion to manage a team of 50 engineers, industrial staff and administrators out in the wilds of Lincolnshire. And this is where I introduce my relationship with Tony Benn. Dad loved politics, and Tony had been one of my father's political idols, whose career Dad had followed since the 1950s, and the fact he was a great orator who loved his own voice. In May 1996, I was studying here at Nottingham Business School for my diploma in management studies. My dissertation, for which I got a distinction, was based on the cathedral paradigm as a change management model, and I submitted my thesis on the same day as an important presentation being given by Tony Benn at his Chesterfield constituency. I arrived just in time at Chesterfield Civic Hall to sit next to my dad's hero. Tony took the stage, looked straight at me, and took to the microphone. Titled, "What's spirituality got to do with politics?" He began his presentation by recalling that very same cathedral paradigm. My jaw dropped in complete shock as he continued to use the metaphor and its relevance in politics word for word, just as I had written on the first page of my dissertation. Going up to him afterwards, I asked him how he knew, and he said he took the cue from me and thanked me. I was astounded, and a connection had been made. In July 2008, Dad was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and was given 6 months to live. Although my family were in complete denial, I knew this was the end and I needed to act fast. I wanted to give Dad the best care and went to every appointment and treatment with him. His chemo ward became our sanctuary as he began to open up. The nurses were astounded by how well he looked, questioning George whether he was really ill. I knew that he was now in touch with the person he really was, what Winnicott calls the true self, and I was so lucky to meet him before it was too late. I wanted to give Dad a gift, to salve his pain so he could die with dignity. I also wanted to salve my own pain. Knowing it was due to politicians and their final Indian solution that had created the trauma of partition, where the impact on the population was given no attention, I believed it would take a politician to be the healing agency to recognise my father's pain and help some restoration of his inner sense of worth and dignity, that Dad and his life did matter, and that he was a much bigger person than his survivor-driven self for which he was judged so unfairly for most of his adult life. So I picked up the phone and left a message for the person I knew who could make that difference. And within half an hour, my phone rang, and after putting forth my request, Tony Benn agreed for me to interview him the following Wednesday at his London home. Tony's father, William Benn, was Secretary of State for India between 1929 to 31, and as an 8-year-old boy, Tony had met Gandhi. When he heard my dad's story, Tony got it and was very angry at Britain's irresponsibility. You can hear that interview on another clip, a personal message from Tony to Dad, as I interviewed and filmed him in his famous pipe smoke-filled basement whilst he made me copious amounts of tea. Take a look at my website to find out more. Pillars of wisdom for resolution. Dad was an intelligent, sensitive, kind-hearted, generous man who was able to love and hold a world view that was benevolent and forgiving. He was also a principled man dogged by fear and shame, pained by many decisions he made that compromised his congruence, living a false sense of survival self that competed with his natural desire to be himself, his true self. There were certain principles he would quietly share with me, what I call the 3 pillars of wisdom, which I will now share. 1. Politics and the world. To always be aware of the news and take an active interest in politics and world events, including reading a good newspaper. He was an avid Manchester Guardian reader, as he would call it. I chose to be an independent reader. 2. 2 pennies parable. If you've got 2 pennies, always give one away and keep one for yourself. You might just save a man's life. And 3. Education and wisdom. Always try and do well in the world. Use your education, your Brahmin wisdom, and your position to influence for good and to relieve suffering. Conclusion. This lecture has been my opportunity to share an account of the human impact of India's partition trauma from 2 different perspectives of its direct and indirect experience for those from Bengal. The journey to reach this point has been a long and arduous one, accessing my dogged determination to make sense of what partition trauma really meant and what it looks like. No longer wanting to live a mediocre life of learned helplessness, a suppressed anger-fueled blame and reduced expectations, I chose to take a route out of my black hole. My long search for meaning has required me to access deep courage to face the darkest nights of my soul, including my family's pain, and to be able to separate out what is mine and not mine so healing can happen. Through slow processing of all those emotions that were locked away from birth, to grieving the very many losses I have had, to finally being able to let go of hope, most notably to have a mum who could love me. I have been able to face my reality and find the beginnings of my freedom. And that freedom is turning to liberation as I stand and share this story with you. And today, as I no longer have to keep my life a secret. The fact that so many people became victims of a political decision and so many more would go on to be affected demonstrates the impact that actions can have. From early on in life, I was determined to find a way to release me and my family from the undeserved shackles of shame. It's taken a long time to make sense and do the necessary processing to gain the vital understanding of impact and effect that's eventually given me the beginnings of freedom through power of action. In my acknowledgement of those key people that have been with me as witnesses, mentors and vital lifelines of loving support and affirmation along this what's been an extremely difficult and lonely journey, I want to thank the following. Bob King, as my mentor, who in 1994 gave me the gift of the cathedral parable and paradigm, who showed belief in me, and boy did I run with it. To Gary Smurden White as my line manager, who saw me and the worth in and believed in me, and Verna, his wife, and both would become my surrogate parents, showing me continued love and generosity of spirit at a time when I faced utter rejection and isolation by my family. To Dr. Margaret Smith, who has walked my journey for these past 8 years, and to whom I will be deeply indebted. Never did I think, Margaret, that 2 years ago I would be standing here today, sharing this story publicly, as you witnessed mine in the sanctuary of your room. To my many students, colleagues and book writing focus group who sit in this audience and have trusted to allow me to share what I have and to help me build my Praxis Cathedral. To Ellen O'Hara and the Real Creative Futures programme. As my writing mentor, you have been my catalyst for open expression and to getting my book written. And finally, to Richard Broadley, whom I met all those years ago and who opened my eyes to a better quality of life. Although you may not have the physical ability to see now, your insight and capability of seeing who I am, truly am, has given me the light to continue walking this dark path, and you have walked it with me. So I leave you with this. The next time you see and hear about someone who has suffered tragedy and may come from a foreign world to the one you know, instead of jumping to conclusions, numbing out, phasing out, or wanting to make it better for them, but ultimately for yourself, I invite you to simply take a moment to pause and let your initial judgments pass. Simply acknowledge that they have a life of experiences valid to them. Maybe the world that they've known has changed by war, by some other means. By being in that conscious pause, you are offering a crucial holding space that might simply offer an acknowledgement of their existence, a positive stroke which can go a long, long way towards supporting recovery and more. An acknowledging gesture, like a smile or a listening ear, is like giving away a penny whilst you hold on to yours. No one loses, and a win-win situation is formed. A relationship in that moment has formed. Thank you.